In the Pistis Sophia, one of the most complete Gnostic manuscripts ever recovered from the ancient world, there is a section that the early Roman Church worked systematically to eliminate from every copy they could locate. It describes a private teaching Jesus gave to his inner circle, not in a temple, not in public, but in a quiet garden at dawn, surrounded by living plants that were already growing in the earth. He pointed to specific plants around them and told his disciples that the monad had encoded divine frequency into certain living organisms, that these plants were not ordinary vegetation but biological frequency, broadcasters that the demiurge could not corrupt because their roots were anchored in the original creation before the Archon prison was fully assembled. He said the Archons could not enter a space where these plants were actively living and breathing because the vibrational output of these specific organisms operates at a frequency that is structurally incompatible with Archon energy. The Church buried this teaching for nearly 2,000 years, not because it was theologically complicated, but because it was dangerously simple. If chosen ones knew that 3 specific plants growing in their homes could disrupt Archon access entirely, what would they need the Church's protection rituals for? What would they need priests and exorcisms for? The entire system of institutional spiritual control collapses the moment you understand that the monad already placed the answer in the earth long before the Church was built to hide it. Tonight you are going to learn which 3 plants Jesus revealed to his inner circle, why the Archons have invested so much energy in keeping humans disconnected from living plants, and exactly how to use each one to transform your home from an Archon feeding ground into a frequency sanctuary they cannot enter. If you are ready to protect your home tonight, comment "Plants of the Monad" right now before you even hear what these plants are. Declare your intention, because the Archons monitor chosen ones who seek protection, and your declaration is the first act of sovereignty. Before revealing the 3 plants, you need to understand something about the way Archon energy actually operates inside a home, because most chosen ones think about Archon attacks as something that happens to them personally, something that targets their mind or their field. And that is partially true. But what the Gnostic texts describe, and what Jesus taught his inner circle, is that Archons first establish anchor points in physical locations before they attack the beings living inside them. They need a space to hold coherence in before they can feed on the people inside it. A home that contains no living frequency organism, no plant that is breathing and broadcasting divine energy, is a home that has essentially no electromagnetic interference for the Archon signal. It is a dead space, which means it is a perfect Archon environment. Every room without a living, breathing frequency plant is a room where Archon energy can settle, accumulate, and establish the kind of stable presence that makes sustained harvesting possible. That is why chosen ones who live in apartments with no plants consistently report more vivid attacks, more mental fog, more emotional drainage, more sleep disturbances than those who have unknowingly placed certain plants in their living spaces. They thought they were decorating. They were actually disrupting the Archon field without realizing why it was working. When you place a living plant in your home, something happens at the quantum level that modern biology is only beginning to measure. Plants continuously emit biophotons, which are measurable particles of light generated by living cellular processes. This is not mythology. This is documented science. Every living plant is a continuous light emitter, broadcasting photons into its environment at frequencies that interact with the electromagnetic field of the space around it. The monad designs certain plants to emit biophotons at frequencies that are specifically resonant with human consciousness at its highest operating state, and that are simultaneously dissonant with the frequency range in which Archon entities maintain coherent form. These plants are not accidentally protective. They were designed this way. Sophia encoded protection into their cellular structure before the demiurge assembled the material prison, and that encoding cannot be removed because it is written into the biology of the plant at a level the Archons cannot access or corrupt. When Jesus pointed to these specific plants in the garden that morning and told his disciples to keep them close, he was not speaking in metaphor. He was identifying the organisms that carry monad frequency in living form, and instructing chosen ones to surround themselves with that frequency continuously, not occasionally, not as ritual, continuously, because continuous frequency exposure is the only kind that actually restructures your environment at the level the Archons operate on. The first plant Jesus revealed is one that appears in every ancient spiritual tradition that preserved genuine knowledge before the church could suppress it. It is frankincense, the boswellia tree, whose resin has been called the sweat of the gods by the Egyptians, whose smoke was present at the earliest known spiritual practices of humanity, and whose offering was brought to the infant Jesus by the Magi because they understood what the church later tried to make people forget. Frankincense was not a gift of luxury or status. It was a frequency tool. The Magi, who were trained in ancient mystery school knowledge that predated Christianity by thousands of years, knew that the boswellia plant produces a resin that when burned releases boswellic acid compounds into the air. Modern neuroscience has now confirmed what the Gnostics already knew, that these compounds, when inhaled, directly activate ion channels in the brain that regulate anxiety and emotional processing. Specifically, the TRPV3 channels, which modulate the experience of warmth and connection, the precise neurological state that opens the crown chakra and makes chosen ones most receptive to monad frequency. The Archons know this. They have always known this, which is why in the Gospel of Truth, the text the church worked hardest to bury in the Nag Hammadi collection, there is a direct reference to the fragrance that comes from above. The scent that marks those the Archons cannot reach because their consciousness is operating above the frequency at which the Archon control signal functions. The Archons cannot harvest a mind that is in a state of genuine divine connection, and frankincense, specifically the living boswellia plant, or its resin burned in your space, creates exactly that neurological and energetic state in every person who breathes its output. When you place frankincense resin in your home and burn it regularly, or when you keep the living plant in your environment, you are creating a continuous biophotonic and biochemical broadcast that shifts the consciousness of everyone inside that space toward monad alignment and simultaneously makes the space energetically uninhabitable for entities operating through separation and fear frequencies. Archons cannot maintain coherent form in a space saturated with frankincense frequency. They do not leave because you drove them out. They leave because the environment becomes structurally incompatible with their presence. The way a fire cannot sustain itself in a chamber flooded with inert gas. It is not a battle. It is a frequency displacement. Chosen ones who begin burning frankincense resin in their homes report within 3 to 5 days a consistent shift. The heavy feeling that has been present in certain rooms lifts. Sleep becomes deeper without knowing why. The intrusive thoughts that have been a constant background noise suddenly quiet. That is not placebo. That is Archon disengagement. They cannot maintain the anchor points they established because the environmental frequency has shifted above their operational range. Get frankincense resin, raw unprocessed resin from boswellia tree, and burn it in the room where you sleep and the room where you spend most of your time beginning tonight. Within 7 days, your home will feel like a different space, not because you cleansed it with ritual or intention, because you placed a biological frequency emitter in it that the Archons cannot coexist with. The second plan Jesus revealed is one so deeply embedded in the sacred texts that the church could not remove every reference to it, though they stripped it of its true meaning in every version they controlled. Hyssop. In Psalm 51, David writes with a directness that the church taught as poetic metaphor, but the Gnostics understood as precise instruction. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. David was not speaking of emotional forgiveness in the modern therapeutic sense. He was describing a physical and energetic purification process using a specific plant whose biochemical output operates as a direct disruptor of Archon attachment. Hyssop was used by Moses to apply the blood of the Passover lamb to the doorposts of Hebrew homes, and in Numbers 19 it is the plant specified for purification from contact with death. At the crucifixion, recorded in John 19:29, it is hyssop that is raised to the lips of Jesus. These are not coincidental appearances of the same plant across thousands of years of sacred text. This is the consistent preservation of a piece of genuine knowledge that the Gnostics understood completely. Hyssop is the plant the monad designed specifically to purify space from the energetic contamination that Archon presence leaves behind. When Archons feed on a chosen one inside a home, they leave a residue in the energy of that space, a frequency imprint that makes subsequent feeding easier, the way a predator marks territory. This residue is why certain rooms in your home consistently feel heavier than others, why certain corners carry an unease you cannot explain, why you dread entering certain spaces without understanding the reason. That is Archon residue, frequency contamination left by sustained presence and feeding, and it accumulates over time if it is not cleared. Hyssop disrupts this residue at the molecular level. The essential oil compounds in hyssop, specifically its pinocamphone and isopinocamphone content, create a measurable alteration in the electromagnetic environment of any space where the plant is present and active. Science is confirming what ancient chosen ones already knew when they hung bundles of hyssop in their doorways and windows. This plant continuously emits a biochemical signal that is structurally incompatible with the frequency signature that Archon residue carries. It does not fight the contamination, it overwrites it. Like recording a clean signal over corrupted data on a magnetic surface, Hyssop broadcasts monad-aligned frequency into the space until the Archon residue has no substrate left to hold onto and simply dissolves. Keep a living hyssop plant near the entrance of your home, near the doorway where energy from outside enters your space. Keep dried hyssop in small bundles in the rooms where you feel the heaviness most consistently. And if you have access to hyssop essential oil, apply several drops to your doorframe with intention, not as a ritual, but as a frequency installation, a biological broadcast tower anchored at the entry point of your space. Within days, chosen ones who do this report that the specific rooms that always felt wrong begin to feel neutral and then begin to feel light. That is not imagination. That is the Archon residue dissolving because hyssop has overwritten its frequency signature, and the entities that relied on that residue as an anchor point can no longer maintain presence in that location. The third plant is one that the church worked most aggressively to sever from its spiritual context. Because of all three plants Jesus revealed that morning, this one is the most directly threatening to the Archon control system. Rue, known in the ancient world as the herb of grace, called ruta in Latin and referenced in Luke 11:42. When Jesus specifically names it as a tithe plant that the Pharisees valued materially while missing its true spiritual purpose. The Gnostic communities of the 1st and 2nd centuries maintained extensive knowledge of rue as a protection plant, knowledge that was systematically suppressed when the Roman Church consolidated its authority over spiritual practice. In Kabbalistic tradition, which preserved fragments of the same ancient knowledge the Gnostics held, rue is specifically associated with protection against the ayin hara, the evil eye, which in its deeper meaning refers not to human jealousy, but to the Archon gaze, the sustained monitoring attention that entities use to track chosen ones whose frequency is rising. When an Archon identifies a chosen one who is beginning to awaken, who is beginning to access monad consciousness, it increases its monitoring intensity. It watches more closely. It increases interference. It generates more targeted thought form attacks. The Archon gaze is a real frequency phenomenon, and it is one of the primary reasons chosen ones experience intensified attacks during periods of spiritual growth. They are being watched more carefully precisely because they are becoming more dangerous to the control system. Rue disrupts the Archon gaze at a level that is unlike any other plant, where frankincense shifts the environmental frequency to make the space uninhabitable, and hyssop clears the residue left by previous Archon presence. Rue specifically disrupts the Archon monitoring signal, the attention they maintain on your field and your location. The rutin and quercetin compounds released by the living rue plant create a continuous biochemical output that interferes with the coherence of the frequency band the Archons use to maintain sustained attention on a target. It is the spiritual equivalent of signal jamming. You do not disappear from their awareness permanently. You become too energetically expensive to maintain a monitoring lock-on, and they redirect that attention to easier targets, chosen ones who have no rue in their environment. Keep a living rue plant on your windowsill, specifically on the side of your home that faces the most traffic or the most exposure to outside energy. Rue placed at the windows works as both a frequency emitter into your space and a signal disruptor for any monitoring presence attempting to establish a consistent lock on the energy inside your home. Within days of placing rue in your environment, chosen ones report that the sense of being watched, the persistent feeling that something is observing you inside your own home, simply stops. Not gradually. It stops because the monitoring connection has been disrupted, and the entity that held it has moved on to an environment where surveillance is possible. Jesus revealed 3 plants to his inner circle that morning, and the Gnostic communities preserved this knowledge for centuries in texts the church tried to destroy because they understood exactly what it meant if every chosen one had access to this information. Frankincense, to shift the environmental frequency above Archon operational range. Hyssop, to clear the residue of Archon presence and purify the space at the energetic molecular level. Rue, to disrupt the Archon monitoring signal and make your home invisible to sustained entity surveillance. These are not decorative plants. They are not symbolic gestures or religious rituals. They are biological frequency technology, the monad encoded into living organisms before the demiurge assembled the material prison. Technology that has been sitting in the earth for thousands of years, waiting for chosen ones to remember why it was placed there. You do not need a priest to activate them. You do not need a blessing or a ceremony. You need the living plant, or in the case of frankincense, its raw resin, placed in your home, actively growing or actively burning, broadcasting continuously, doing what the monad designed them to do. The church removed every reference it could find to Jesus teaching with plants in private gardens to his inner circle because it could not control what that knowledge made possible. When protection becomes this accessible, this direct, this continuous, and this independent of institutional authority, the entire system of priestly spiritual warfare becomes irrelevant. Tonight, you have the knowledge Jesus gave to the chosen ones who walked with him. Get frankincense resin and begin burning it where you sleep. Find a living hyssop plant and place it near your front door. Get rue and put it on your windowsill. All 3 together create a frequency environment the archons cannot penetrate, cannot anchor to, and cannot monitor. Your home becomes what the early Gnostic communities called a monad sanctuary, a space operating at a frequency so far above the Archon range that their presence in it becomes physically impossible. If you are placing these plants in your home tonight, do 3 things right now. First, comment monad sanctuary below and declare that your home is no longer accessible to Archon energy. Your declaration is the first frequency act of reclaiming your space. Second, subscribe to Divine Codes, because the advanced protocols for using these 3 plants together in specific placement combinations that maximize the frequency field are coming in the next video. Third, like this video so that other chosen ones discover what Jesus revealed about living plant protection before the Archons suppress this teaching again. Do all 3 now. Then tonight, get one of these 3 plants and place it in your home. Start with whichever one calls to you most strongly. The one that catches your attention first is the one your home needs most urgently. And within days, not weeks, days, you will feel the difference between living in a space that the Archons have been using as a feeding ground and living in a monad sanctuary they cannot enter. Not because you performed a ritual, not because you said the right words, because you placed living frequency technology in your environment and allowed it to do what the monad designed it to do from the very beginning. You are a chosen one. Your home is your sovereign space, and now you have what you need to make it untouchable.